Peter, the costs of moving the facilities at Garden Island North have been described as enormous. Are there any long-term strategic benefits to this move, and do they outweigh the costs in the long term?
I think it's very unlikely that the Navy will ever completely move from Garden Island, and there's a number of reasons for that. Firstly, it's one of Australia's oldest defence bases, almost going back to foundation. Secondly, probably more importantly, there's been a massive investment in infrastructure into the base. There's the largest dry dock facility in Australia, for example, and to actually take those things and to recreate them in another port is going to add enormously to the $6 billion cost that's already been quoted to create a new Navy base in Brisbane. So I think Garden Island is here to stay. But the problem is that even beyond Garden Island, the Navy does have a need for a new facility to take account of the large number of ships that we have planned and coming into service over the next decade or so. And that will ultimately mean that we need to look at a second naval base somewhere on the east coast in order to accommodate those vessels.
Today on The Strategist, Sam Bateman said that HMAS Cuttable and Fleet Base East are very congested and there's no room for expansion. What's your reaction to this?
Well, it certainly is true. If you visit Fleet Base East on almost any day, it looks very crowded with large numbers of naval vessels up against the pier. And when you then factor into one's considerations the arrival of the two enormous amphibious vessels over the next few years, that is going to change the picture of what can happen within Sydney Harbour. I think that Navy will need to manage its presence at the fleet base, and probably in a decade or so the situation we'll have is that the frigates and destroyers will largely be operating out of Fleet Base East. The amphibious vessels and the support vessels, I imagine, might be operating out of a second naval establishment somewhere on the east coast. And over in the west in Stirling, the submarines will largely be based with their maintenance taking place in Adelaide. That starts to look like what the future deployment of Navy is going to be in terms of basing infrastructure in Australia.
Sam Bateman also said that while moving fleet-based east out of Sydney would incur large direct costs, the cost of keeping it there are also significant, as the Woolloomooloo Wharves and Potts Point could be used for other purposes. Does the opportunity cost outweigh the direct costs?
Well, there's big costs associated with keeping navies in any infrastructure. That's just a reality of the modern defence budget. I think that the costs of moving the Navy completely out of Garden Island would be too high, and I don't see that there is actually sufficient return for defence or for the Commonwealth or indeed for the state government to do that against the other uses of the facility which are being put forward. So it's said that the facility could be used for cruise ships to come into berth, but in fact it's quite possible for the Navy to share that space with cruise ships when they visit Sydney Harbour. I think that's the best way to deal with that situation. I think also this points to a significant problem for Defence, which is that the department has almost ceased investment in infrastructure over the last few years. Base expenditure is something that can be easily cut, as the defence budget has been cut. So we've seen a lack of maintenance money, for example, being spent on facilities all around the country. And somehow what Defence needs to do is to factor into its budget the long-term costs associated with maintaining existing bases and the costs of establishing a new naval base at some point in the next 10 or 15 years.
Even if the facilities at Garden Island are to remain in place, is there scope for a northern base to meet the future demands of the Navy? And is there political will for establishing a supplemental fleet base?
Well, we've seen political will in the form of Prime Minister Rudd expressing his plans yesterday, and that I think does indicate that there is an understanding that there is a need to talk about the long-term basing infrastructure for the country. Also, there is, I think, bipartisan political support for the idea of Defence maintaining a more visible presence in the north of the country, the northwest of Australia, and also in northern Queensland. that's something that can really be done through exercises and showing a presence rather than building basing infrastructure. Where we haven't seen much in the way of clear political will on either side of the political fence recently has been the willingness to talk about the dollars that are necessary to invest to actually deliver this as a reality. It's all very well to talk about what might be happening in 2030, which is Mr. Rudd's focus, but really where is the investment going to come from? There's no demonstration of political will for that yet, and unfortunately what that means is that there's a gap in the budget between the aspirations that government would like and the reality of what we'll be able to afford.
What are the implications for the Prime Minister's announcement for the recent Defence White Paper?
Well, I think it's a very interesting thing that the Prime Minister has effectively taken a 180-degree opposite position on the basing infrastructure issue compared to what was in the White Paper of 2013, released just 3 months ago in May this year. In that document, the White Paper said that it would not contemplate building a Navy base in Brisbane because the cost was too great. Here we are 12 weeks later, the Prime Minister has said that's exactly what he proposes to do. And really what I think that points to is that the 2013 Defence White Paper, to coin a phrase, is dead, buried and cremated. What Mr. Rudd has done has to disinter his own White Paper, the one that he produced in 2009. That was the White Paper which talked about a major maritime build-up, a doubling of the submarine fleet. So we're back to the future where the 2009 White Paper, at least for the next 10 days or so, is really the de facto defence policy statement that people should be reading. Then after the election, we'll have to see what a new government might do.
And what are the implications of Mr. Rudd's announcement for the future Defence White Paper?
Well, I think that whichever side wins the federal election on the 7th of September, we know now that there is a need for new defence policy to be developed. The Coalition has said that they will produce a white paper within 18 months or so. The Labor Party has not made a similar claim, but I think if Prime Minister Rudd came back, given what seems to be his rather negative views of the 2013 White Paper, they will need to develop a new White Paper as well. So I think one way or another, both sides of politics, should they find themselves in government, will have to contemplate developing a new White Paper statement, and they'll need to start thinking about what they intend to do with the basing infrastructure question, which so far has been put to one side, largely for reasons of cost, but I think is becoming increasingly a prominent part of the defence debate. So some extra funding has to be found, or some extra savings have to be made in defence in order to create the space for a new discussion to take place about future basing infrastructure for defence.